pleasant morning, pleasant morning. We're going to start in just a moment. I'm making sure everyone is logged in. I'm making sure that everyone is logged. All right, we are 2 minutes past the time when we said that we would be starting. And I am, as you can tell, I am on a high. I am on a high. When I told you this morning when we had our devotions, I don't know if it's because I woke up on this beautiful, marvelous Monday morning, or I'm not certain if it's because my son is 18 now and he'll be driving me around and he's the man and he can do stuff for me now. But whatever the reason, or maybe it's because Independence in a couple of days. Independence morning. But anywho, I'm excited because guess what? We're getting a new text. And the author is here with us. She's gracing us with her presence. Aren't we so special? We're so special. So special. An introduction to Shelbie Mott, a writer's journey to reclaiming culture. What an interesting topic today. This morning, as we continue, as we learn together, this session, the presenter will discuss her journey in writing the novel, The Island of Shelbie Mott. Her discussion will include an exploration of the themes and stylistic elements used in creating the fictional world of Shelbie Mott, and also used in reclaiming the idyllic past within the context of the Bahamas. For this session, our presenter will be none other than Ms. Ernestia Fraser. Ernestia Fraser is a traditionally published author and internationally award-winning poet and screenwriter with dual BAs in English and Communication and an MFA in Creative Writing. Screenwriting. Currently, she's serving as an assistant professor in the School of English Studies at the University of the Bahamas. She is so passionate about the writings that she does. She contributes to both and creative spheres. This morning, we are going to get a glimpse of what it is that this text is about. We'll get a glimpse into the life of the author as she presents to us the findings and the readings of this great text. And you thought that you were excited about this morning's session. You haven't seen anything yet, because guess what? This is the meat. This is the gravy. This is everything that's going to pull this session together. And I am elated because she's here. Let me see those hand claps in virtual land. Let's hear some noise in the background as we welcome the presenter for this session, the author of this great text, Miss Ernestia Fraser. Let me see those hands. Let me see those emojis. I don't see anything. Let me see. Let's welcome her. It's going to be an amazing session. Mrs. Fraser.
Good morning, and thank you so much. I feel the pressure is on. I am preceded by such great presentations, a lot of rich information. I am truly honored to be here. I want to thank Mrs. Moultrie, Mrs. Newton-Bowe, and also Ms. Pratt-Morris, and other educational officers engaged in this particular process of onboarding Shelbie Mott into the curriculum. And I thank each of you for your participation, your presence here today. Forgive me, I'm going to veer a little bit of what was presented into the description. And I think this presentation will basically focus on the general literary elements, things such as themes and style and characters. I just want to give a sort of overview of the book from my perspective. And I will say something about Shelbie. Shelbie really was in my imaginary mind for about 2, maybe 3 years. and the first draft was completed about 5 years ago. The revisions it was a bit of a grueling process, but um, this particular book came with such unction. I could not escape it, and so I just had to be dutiful in doing the work and getting it out there, and as polished as I possibly can to particular literary standards, for the book's sake, and then also for the community of readers. Shelby is a labor of love, but also a product of great excitement, because I can remember writing the book and being so excited about how the stories were unfolding. And I have to talk about Shelby in the third person because, there's a separation for me in the character, in the sense that Shelby sort of, I guess, planned her own her own outcome, or she willed herself into existence, as a particular narrative. Um, so let's just get into the presentation. Bear with me. I was not feeling well for a while, and so I'm on the mend. So my energy, I'll do my best to maintain good energy. But so yes, the presentation, a literary journey and exploration of the island of Shelbie Mott. I just want to give a quick overview. We're going to look very briefly at my background. I'm going to talk about the story's inspiration, give a brief plot overview, look at setting, character, some key themes, some stylistic elements. I will talk about cultural impact from my perspective, and also give just a few recommendations for the classroom. And I believe at the end of the presentation, I would want to hear more from you, the teachers, educators, the readers of, I know I sent out 3 chapters from the book, and I would love to hear some feedback. Any concerns, questions, and so forth. So we will have time to sort of engage each other toward the end of the presentation. But if there's any pressing questions, if they come up in the chat, or if someone's raising their hand, because I'm not able to see that and manage that, if Mrs. Bow, if you can sort of chime in or interrupt and indicate if I need to be stopped to respond to a question or comment. So let me get into my background. Writers typically are more in the background. They don't so much talk about themselves, or even maybe like to talk about their work, but just so that you're familiar with, who I am and where I come from. But I'm born and raised in Nassau. Um, I know the uh, person who introduced me spoke to my educational background. My passion is for creative writing, so I got my BA focused, in English, and then, of course, I got a MFA in creative writing. I The focus is screenwriting, which is basically writing scripts for movies or television. A very difficult industry, and not so much of an industry here, but it's something that I still practice in. Um, as a writer, I would say I have over 15 years of experience. My first book is Carnival of Love. That was written, I want to say, about 17 years ago. And Carnival, I guess I'll touch on it here. Carnival was traditionally published in 2010. And so I think that really marked a bit of a professional journey for writing for me. I do write across genres. Um, I love each genre for what they can offer. Me as a writer, screenwriting, I think, is my most challenging genre. I love poetry, so my works are assorted. If you've ever seen any of the other stuff, and it's just, as a writer, I just have to find the different ways to express myself. So I guess I keep it versatile. I do have some awards in screenwriting and poetry. And then if you ever want to, I guess, get some more information about me or my work, or anything, or any information or contact for your students, you can find a bit more on my website, ernestiafraser.com. All right. I'll move on to the next slide. I want to talk about the story's inspiration. Um, I think when Shelby originally unveiled or started to unveil herself. I mean, it was something that the story itself connected strongly with my childhood. So when I talk about Shelby, one of the greatest things about writing the book was it allowed me to sort of reimagine childhood. In some ways, it was reminiscent of childhood. Shelby is completely fiction, but I will say that there are some light biographical, I guess, moments. But as fiction, I mean, none of it is my story, but there are key features in terms of when I was a child, I used to play outdoors a lot. I was actually quite a tomboy. I did play with neighborhood boys, and to some extent, I guess I'm going to put it out there. I probably, I can't say I was a bully, but I was a bit, they looked up to me in the sense I sort of ran this circle of neighborhood boys. So Shelby, I guess she's an extension of a bit of that history. Another reason I enjoyed exploring Shelby was because it paid a homage to a sort of pre-technology world. And not that technology doesn't exist in the world of Shelby, it does. But there's not an oversaturation of technology, particularly an oversaturation of social media. So I think older generations, because Shelby is a book for all ages, and I think older generations will find that they are able to connect in the book in different ways because we can talk about the times that we did actually play outside versus sitting at a computer or looking at a tablet or just sticking to the phone. When I was a kid, I played out, there was a rule I was allowed to play outside. I played outside essentially all day. But my dad had a rule, you can play outside until the lights turn on because that was the switch from day to evening to night. So Shelby celebrates that time really before the oversaturation of social media and technology. And I think that there's something very innocent and very rich and rewarding about that time. And in fact, studies show that um, when children or young adults they are using their imagination and they're playing outside of technology, they actually create more memories. Their memories are more resonant and richer. So for example, if you were like me, you probably remember a time where you climbed the neighbor's plum tree and maybe got in trouble because you're in someone's yard versus your yard, versus you playing a particular game and having less of a context or framework to create memories. So that's something I would love to see stressed in terms of the setting and the social and cultural environment of Shelby Mott. The book is also an exploration of land and culture. I think that's just a natural given. Um, I, I'm a Bahamian, part of the wider Caribbean. I love my culture. I love where I'm from, and I think Shelby Mott, and it may not be as on the nose as it could be, but it really was a sort of celebration of where I'm from. Um, Shelby is also a representation of Bahamian youth. I'm not sure if it's a quintessential representation, but it is a representation. I think that there are some experiences, some values, some ways of thinking that youth back then had, and even youth of today. So I think young persons and older persons will really be able to connect with Shelby Mott, maybe seeing um, fractions of themselves, whether in the main character or in other characters, or maybe they recognize some traits from Grammy Shirley or Anne Deb that is reminiscent of their own experiences. So I think Shelby, in some sense, will be a bit of a figurine for our youth culture, and some representation of that. And lastly, I think my job as a writer is just to write a good story. Um, so I don't think I thought much about audience in writing the story because, I think that really is my only job to write a good story. But I think on the flip side, my job as an educator is to share a good story. Um, it's interesting having to talk about my own book, but I do think I wanted to put out something of quality that added to the literary landscape in the Bahamas. I do think that there needs to be more promotion, in fact, more development of Bahamian literature. So we Bahamian writers are tasked with, meeting certain standards and taking it up a bit notch. Um, so there should be, more emphasis on the literary development and inclusion, and also a strong promotion of reading. I know, as it stands, there's a separation of the English and the literature, but as persons before me have made the case, that they're on a spectrum to where they sort of lean into each other. And I think literature is such a ground basis to develop very important skills such as critical thinking, analytical thinking. Can remember listening to a presentation on um, the fact that literature promoted a more democratic society because of the empathy and or ability to generate empathy, or to generate or give students the ability to see from another perspective, and how that tied into creating very strong, well-rounded, empathetic, and democratic citizens. So I think there's a lot of value in our stories. And I've told Mrs. Newton-Bow before, I said, when you think about high school and or school in terms of the things that you remember, you don't necessarily remember Pythagoras theory or a mathematical equation. Oftentimes you remember the stories that you heard, the stories that you read. And that's, I think literature is something that can stay and resonate with a student, with a learner, with a person well beyond its introduction. So well, I'm a proponent for literature, so I would love to see more of that, even if it's outside of Shelbie Mott, because I think we have a lot to share culturally through the arts. Um, I guess I'll pause in case if there's any questions or responses at this point. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to try to keep the time. So I have about an
Sorry,
hour. Yeah,
Ms.
go ahead.
Fraser, are you going to share your screen or when you're
Um,
ready?
Actually, I thought I was sharing it. Let me go ahead and start it again. I'm not sure what happened. Okay. Sorry about that. Is it shared at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not in slideshow, mode though.
Okay. What you can do if you want, someone can share it on their end, and then I guess I could take it from there.
Okay, Mr.
So
Spa. Okay, you can stop sharing and Mr. Spa will share, for you.
sure, no problem. And I do apologize for that. And I believe you will send this out to every person here.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Barr, thank you so much. All right, so we're on the slide, the plot overview. So I'll read the plot. I'm not going to get too much into it because this is actually what you read when you look at the back of the book, just to let you know what the story is about. So it reads, it's the summer of 91, and Bahamian tomboy Shelbie Mott is secretly in love with Johnny Ingram, a boy so handsome that even the Queen of England would knight him just based off his looks. Unfortunately, Johnny is head over heels for Akara, the green-eyed girl next door. The feeling of unrequited quieted love upsets Shelby, but in no way tempers her daring attitude and growing enthusiasm for a summer of adventure with the boys. Together, she and her gang of pirates and soldiers explore the complexities of a world made up of domineering parents, rock fights, unwanted crushes, and preposterous chores. Each challenge presented inspires Shelby to uncover a deep-seated strength, but it's the reality of possibly losing her love or first love that threatens to mar the beauty of summer forever. So in a nutshell, this book is you can call it an unrequited love story or a coming of age story, but this is more than that, a story about friendship and about navigating those relationships, whether it's friends or family, and allowing your exploration of that to sort of add some new growth to yourself. And in this case, speaking of Shelbie. So that's the plot. I want to get into the story setting. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay. So the timeline. So the story, well, as you know, setting can relate to a number of things, place, time frame, and so forth. One thing that I think that needs to be key in terms of sharing with students is the timeline. They need to understand that this is a sort of story that took place in the 90s, particularly the summer of 96, because, 96 is different from 2006 or 2024. So I think discussions surrounding even the time differences can be useful. Um, the story is set in New Providence, Bahamas. It's also set specifically in the Sharpton neighborhood, and that's a fictional name, the Sharpton. So I used a mixture of real names and also fictional names, I guess, as I was led. There will also be some reference to, I guess, smaller, minor settings like the Fruit Grove, the beach, downtown. Shelby also attends a church service, and she makes references to church at times. There's also a reference to Luther, Long Island, Grand Key. Grand Key, actually, when I wrote that in the story, that really was a fictional place, although Grand Key does exist. I had in mind, actually, for the character to be coming from Grand Bahama, but I didn't want to tag on such a negative character to Grand Bahama. But in the event, it just worked out to Grand Key because I still wanted that grand in there. But I will say about setting, it's moderate to light in terms of the sense of a setting. I think the most palpable thing about setting is the fact that this story takes place in the natural world. So nature, I think more than anything, gives me the strongest sense of place. And for another reader, it may be different. And for a story, well, I'm going to reference stories outside of the three chapters that you had. And I think it's okay to do that because I would want to, tie things together more broadly. But there are stories like Downtown, which specifically speaks to some of what downtown might have been like in the 90s for Shelby, particularly. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. I want to get into a bit of the character overview. And then after the character overview, I'll open it up for questions. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce some of the characters. These are not all the characters within the story, but some of the main characters. Shelbie Mott, as you know, she's the narrator. She's the protagonist. She's a tomboy. I had to put in the word advocate, and I think I will get more into that descriptor in my next session tomorrow. But Shelby is very rough. And in fact, sometimes I think it's okay for me to look at Shelby as a bit of an anti-hero because I think even when I wrote her, I thought that, wow, she's a little bit rough. She may not be at first palatable for readers because she's so her language sometimes may come across as a bit crass. In earlier versions, I think I even made a decision to temper down language a little bit because I wanted the read to not just relate to, the Caribbean context or the Bahamian culture, but also to the world. And persons are getting quite political with language. So I just had to find a good balance, but I also had to be true to, the language of the times. So as in, with her, even though she's the main character, there may be some moments where students look at the text and say, well, those qualities Shelby probably needs to work on. Another character is Johnny Ingram, and Johnny Shelby's crush. She describes him as very handsome. She's very, I wouldn't say invested is the right word, but she's very enamored by his looks. You know, he's also described as very mannerly and respectful, which is something Shelby actually gets into in certain stories. There's the character Grammy Shirley, and she's Shelby's grandmother. She's also a bush medicine practitioner. She's also well respected. And I will give you a little bit of insight into my creation of Grammy Shirley. I um, I don't have a grandmother who is into bush medicine or anything, so it wasn't something drawn per se from um, my biographical experiences, but I remember some years ago, my mother there was a well-known bush medicine woman who, sold bush medicine. And she was very good, I guess, at taking clients, giving diagnosis and giving them the type of bush tea that they would need. And I remember meeting her, and it was such an interesting experience. I mean, very memorable. So Grammy Shirley comes from a little bit of that, but these were figures that I can't say that we hear about them much or talk about them much, but back in the day, some persons didn't go to the doctor. They went to the lady who sold bush medicine and could prescribe, some Cersei or neem. Um, Another character, Andeb, and you guys have read this sort of expose chapter on her. She is Shelby's aunt. She's a baker, and she's good at gossip, according to Shelbie Mott. There's also this Three Stooges. There's Big Mike, Pink Lip Bradley, and Fast Talking Atkins. And when they're first introduced, their characters seem a bit one-dimensional. Um, and a bit cursory, but there are chapters that give a little bit more background and add some more dimension to these characters. But this is basically Shelby's team, the Three Stooges and Johnny Ingram, because she really only has male friends, and Ricard comes in a little bit later, but and that is the next character, Ricard. She's you know described as a pretty girl. It's very nice, very kind, and she's also Johnny's crush. And I can't even say it's a bit of a love triangle because there is another character at some point where it makes it seem like there's a bit of a love quadrangle where there's sort of four persons, connected to this idea of love or affection. But what I want to do in the next two slides is just read some excerpts, and this is going outside of the three stories that you had, at least for the most part, just to give you an idea of some of the characters. So you can go to the next slide. This one is on Big Mike. Okay, Big Mike. And this is an excerpt. This is probably closer to the top. I always had a soft spot for Mike, not because of anything important, but mainly because of the way he looked. Big Mike looked exactly like how his name sounded. His mummy was round, his daddy was round. Even his baby sister, hardly 2 years old, was a heavy girl. However, Mike had it worse than any of them because he had what island folks called a cock eye. And that meant his two eyes were always looking in the opposite directions, like they were always mad at each other, never wanting to make up or something. When I first met Big Mike, he gave me the heebie-jeebies, as I couldn't look at him for long without wanting to flinch. It wasn't until I got serious about church that I developed what my pastor called sympathy, and was then able to look at him with a straight face. Besides, in being a good Samaritan, it was my job to look at all the extra meat and take pity on him. Mike needed someone like me to help put those two eyes back together, even if it meant I had to boss them back in place. So that's a little bit um, of a character or characterization for Big Mike. And I'll go ahead and read the next slide, the one for Aunt Deb. And then I'll pause for any questions or comments if there's any. All right, and this is from the chapter on Aunt Deb. So it reads, my aunt loved baking so much that her hands and forearms were always covered in flour. She wore like one wore lotion, except lotion disappeared after a while, but flour, not so much. She owned the only bakery in Sharpton, and if any other bakery dared to open nearby, it didn't last very long on account of Aunt Deb's being more delicious. She used to run her business right from Grammy's kitchen, which Grammy didn't like since she also used the area to brew her medicine. So after a while, Grammy decided to install a second kitchen, which Annie decorated with yellow tiles since it was her favorite color. From that day on, the two retreated into their separate spaces, luring hundreds of customers from every block in Nassau. I usually stared clear of Aunt Deb's kitchen in an effort to duck out on any extra chores. However, on Fridays, I always wandered there simply because she routinely made my favorite pastry that day. These were called flour cakes, round, handheld wads of buttery sweet. They were so good that Annie rarely got me birthday gifts, as extra batches of warm flour cakes were good enough substitutions. I enjoyed the ones without the raisins and the cakes that had more nutmeg than fruity tart. I liked them so much that Fridays were the only days I wouldn't complain about chores, which made me, as Annie would say, forget how to row, complain, screw up, and hard mouth. Okay. Any questions or I guess comments at this point before I get into themes? Okay. All right. So I'll move along to the next slide and highlight some key themes. And forgive my pacing. I probably will speed it up a little bit so that I can get some feedback from the chapters that you read. All right. So I will just highlight some of the themes, and granted, not every theme is listed here, and I would hope that the students and as well as the educators have their own exploration of the different chapters. As you know, literature, although you're presented a story, there's also much room for interpretation. So I would, even love to hear back from some of you in time about the themes that you probably discovered or were coined, or you thought that were important. But for now, I'll just list some of the key themes that I thought were necessary to highlight. The first is love. For those who are familiar with the story, a lot of Shelby's, I guess, motivation focuses on spending time with Johnny, who is her crush. So whether you want to give the love a descriptor to say, okay, shallow love or, um, you know, e- erotic love, however you want to describe it. But love is one of the main themes. Family and friendship is also a theme. And in the book, as when you guys read, Shelby does a lot of bossing her friends around, but deep down, Shelby actually has or is developing soft spots for those particular friends, despite her ability to present them as caricatures at times. She also has deep connections to her family and in some sense is still searching for family because when you read the story, Shelby's mom died at childbirth, so she's not in the story. So she relies on, I guess, the guidance from Aunt Deb and also Grammy Shirley. Nature is also a very huge theme. I think, well, I'm personally, I love nature. I'm a nature lover. And so um, I think most of the beautiful elements, that we have to offer as a country is also in the natural realm, but nature is a big theme. Identity and heritage is also pretty key themes. And maybe this is me, but faith and religion, particularly Christianity, and church. Those are themes. There's a touch of Rastafarianism in a chapter called King Percy, but that's light. But faith and religion definitely recurring themes. I think the most exciting theme for me, well, there's childhood innocence, but there's also childhood plays, a very monumental theme for the island of Shelbie Mott. And I think I enjoy presenting that theme here because this is play that we were used to back in the day, or at least that I was used to back in the day, where it didn't require technology. It didn't require a sort of one-dimensional engagement, of something contrived. But the type of play that well, at least me personally, when I was young, that took, vivid imagination and creativity. So being able to take a stick and make a whole game from a stick. So I think play is something that definitely needs to be reinvestigated for everyone. I don't care how old they are. So hopefully this is something that warrants much discussion among students. There are some minor themes, and I guess depending on the story you look at, it may seem a bit more major, but I'll just touch on what I considered minor overall. Homelessness, abuse, abandonment, and forgive the typo, natural medicine, gender roles, race, colonialism. But I think the book is very, very rich in themes, so you'll be able to create a whole list of themes and um, create a study or discussion around those particular themes. So I'm going to highlight two themes. I'll look at two excerpts from the book. So we can move to the next slide. And this particular excerpt touches on faith, religion, Christianity, church as themes. Okay, and I think this is from the chapter. It's called Church. And this probably is more in the middle of that particular chapter. So during one Sunday service, I came up with the idea of keeping a personal record of all the wrongs I'd committed. And this is Shelbie speaking, of course. That way, when I asked the cloud for forgiveness, he could keep better track of things and not get my sins mixed up with somebody else. Then he could take his long white stick of chalk and scotch off my wrongs one by one, removing them off that angry sin list. In observing a weekly record, I counted all the times I teased Big Mike, which is quite a bit. So much so that I had a hard time keeping tally. I also took note of how many times I said something sly to Grammy Shirley under my breath, and of how many times I sass Aunt Deb outright. I even recorded the occasion I cut my eye at Riccara, especially when Johnny was around. After 2 weeks of keeping tally, I feared the countless black strokes marked in my notebook, almost certain that I would be taking the first bus to hell. Fortunately, Pastor Gates and his once-in-a-while sermons on grace made me feel like a visit or two to church could clear everything up between me and the God cloud. So going to church became something similar to drinking bush medicine, except it didn't leave a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. So that's an excerpt from the chapter on church. And Shelbie makes quite a few references to religion or God, and sometimes she describes him as a cloud because she doesn't have a definitive description of him. There's a particular religious text that talk about God as ineffable, an entity that we are unable to describe. And so she uses her own imagination, I guess, her childhood rendering to, I guess, assign an image to God. And let's see, I'm trying to see what else I'm missing in this particular excerpt. But yeah, this is basically her, because in this chapter she wants to live right due to the religious expectations, and so she's taking a tally of all her sins, and it's really hard for her because of course she likes to tease people. So she's trying to really reconcile the best narrow path forward. And I will move on to the next slide, which touches on or emphasizes this theme of nature. And I think this chapter is twofold. She speaks to pigeons and also butterflies. So this is sort of a sub-chapter within a larger chapter on butterflies. I'd enjoy watching caterpillars inching around my see-through jam jars, which I usually kept outside in cool, shaded areas, inserting a twig or two, a few leaves, and small wads of dirt. That way, the crawling worms could feel like they were a part of nature, even though they lived in a glass house. But caterpillars never remained in their form very long. In a short week, their fat, wriggly bodies would shrivel into withering cocoons. Pupas really confused me, as I couldn't imagine how a worm so long and chubby could fit itself into such a tiny casing. This stage of the butterfly was the most mysterious, so I studied their anatomy every chance I got. I knew that despite the pupa's decayed form, days later, a beautiful, colorful creature would emerge. Soon as the enchanted insect completed their transformation, I'd release them back to nature. Butterflies were radiant but gentle summer creatures that never thanked me for taking such good care of them. Up to the heavens they ascended, clumsily at first. Wriggling and drifting, they lifted themselves toward a tangerine sky, flying away from me without ever looking back. And so that's Shelby speaking to, I guess, the different stages a butterfly goes through, and I guess her process with that. And what's interesting is that this one is, I guess, it comes a lot from my history because as a young kid, I used to capture the caterpillars and keep them in a glass jar and sort of watch them metamorphosize and then release them back into nature. So I did definitely have a very, I guess, engaging approach with certain natural elements. Okay, any questions or comments at this point before we get into a few stylistic elements?
There have been some questions posed in the group. One of the questions was, will the text be available to teachers via PDF?
No, not the full text. I think that there are a few stories that I've shared. And I think for, I guess, writers, they typically don't put their work in the PDF format. I am reserved to doing that because this particular book, it's still being shopped to traditional presses. And so, in fact, I was actually quite reserved in terms of printing it yet, but everything happened so quickly. And so for now, it's only available in the book format. And I guess I'll have a later update on that as I see what happens with the sort of publishing world.
Okay. Comment. It is well written, great characterization. Another educator reminds me of the novel Miguel Street. I must say that I am happy that this novel, this is coming from Miss Cassandra Munnings. I must say that I am happy that this novel is now on the BJC list. The students will be able to identify greatly with it. From Miss Kizzy McPhee, I can see teachers and students enjoying and identifying with these characters. Great teaching possibilities and realizations. So many discussions to go beyond the classroom and bring awareness to various social ills. From Nia Mills Hepburn, in relation to the cloud, I was thinking of how many devices can be identified from that description. Could you give more insight into what, in particular, ways which Shelby is relating a cloud to God?
That's a very good question. I feel like I'm in class again. Thank you, Ms. Mills. And thank everyone for their comments. Let me just speak to one of the comments. Someone said it sounds like Miguel Street by V.S. Naipaul. I think because I enjoyed that particular book, and so And Miguel Street's a novel, but it's made up of these chapters that sort of expand on the characterizations of different persons. So Shelbie Mott can comparatively, I guess, be looked at with Miguel Street, and also novels like House on Mango Street, Sandra Cisneros. Um, there's certain things about it that reminds me of Annie John, in terms of the type of language used. So that's an interesting comment. But going back to Mrs. Mills' question, um, well, yeah, I think describing God as a cloud, there's a number of sort of figures of speech, or if you want to, well, figures of speech that can be pulled. Metaphorically, I think Shelby's um, perspective is that, this thing, God, or this entity, God, that we talk about is so formless in our world. So like a cloud, there really is no real form. While we might say that there are manifestations of God, but as a spirit, it's still without form. So I think cloud for her is one of the best comparisons that she could make. There's also another reason to compare God with a cloud is that clouds are very eminent depending on the day. They're also positioned in the sky. When we pray, we often look in the sky. So it's, and of course you guys can pull your own interpretations, but they're really, I think it's a very good question. I think that a lot could be pulled from that in terms of the symbolism, the sort of metaphorical usage of it. And, even if you want to get into hyperbole, but I think I just think it's very interesting the way that children interpret faith, God, and religion at times. And I'll give you an example from my personal life. I used to live with an American family, and they were white, and I had a very strong connection with one of the younger kids. His name was Andrew. He was about maybe 3 years old. And he wanted to understand why my color was the way it was, why it was brown or black. And so I said, well, can you tell me why? Um, um, I look the way I look. And so with his childlike imagination, he said, well, that's because you're really old. You're when you get old, and because this was his reasoning, you're really old, and so when you get old, you turn dark. And so I said, okay, so does that mean I'm older than your grandmother, who of course was about 20, 30 years older than me? And he said, yes, you're older than Gigi. And when Gigi gets, Gigi will turn that color when she gets older. So I just think it's interesting the way that children use their imagination to rationalize certain things about our life and existence. And I think that's something that I I want to say that have been sort of taken away from the cultures. I mean, this is globally, because we're not really taking time to imagine anymore, to exercise imagination, to exercise different ways of thinking. And I think it's a lot of it is due to the oversaturation of technology, and AI is new now. So it's to the point where, persons are reaching uh, I guess, the fork in the road where they can choose not to think, choose not to create, or choose not to imagine. So I think it's going to be very interesting to talk about certain things, particularly. Okay. Anything else before I move on?
Okay, yes. Some Christabel Simpson said some symbolism with the butterflies and caterpillars.
I found this on the web.
Anthony Gilbert said awesome characterization and descriptions and extremely relatable.
Okay.
Stephanie Johnson, I have a question about one of the issues presented in the text about Aunt Deb. It has to do with the theme of abuse, but I need a minute to locate the quote. So she's locating the quote, and once she would have located the quote, then I guess you'll revisit that question.
Sure.
Miss Marjorie Penniman, I've only read the chapter shared, and I'm looking forward to reading this book with my students. It has great potential. Okay, Stephanie Johnson, she would have located it. Quote from the story of Aunt Deb: the daughters and nieces. Even favored grandpa loses love at dancing, though some of that dancing led to lots of trouble. What kind of trouble did this lead to? My imagination piqued even the types of abuses that may have happened in our society and indeed the world.
So with that particular quote, and I think Grammy Shirley gave that quote, there is room to leave it to the imagination and for a person to have interpretation. But the trouble that I did have in mind moderately was basically, women who dance and dancing is, dancing is a pastime. Dancing can be a sport. Sometimes I think that in certain spaces when women dance, they're a little bit over sexualized, or maybe that's the intention to sort of create a call and response, perhaps with the opposite sex. So that trouble really hinted at perhaps some romantic or I didn't think in terms of, I didn't really connect that with abuse, but just sort of mischief. So romantic mischief. You can look at it at that, but there is room for interpretations as students will, of course, come with their own interpretations. And so you can be able to sort of contextualize based on what's there and I guess create conversations.
Okay, and before you continue, we have two more from Ms. Pamela Moss. Did you write this text with a particular grade in mind?
That's a good question. Not at the time. I didn't have a grade in mind because when I read the book, I feel like it's really for all ages from the junior high up. I think I wrote the text for me. But I think the the story probably is ideal for grade 9 up to grade 12, to be honest with you, because it's so rich. So and I would hope that they have some grounding of skills when they sort of engage the book. So I think grade 9 would be a good sort of time frame or age. But of course, I think 10 to 12, I think they would actually enjoy this book or engage this book in a very rich way.
Okay, Cassandra Munnings. The cloud of Shelby, in her innocence or premature faith, can be symbolic to the cloud used to guide the children of Israel on their journey to the promised land. And the last,
Beautiful. That's good.
how many we have here? I really love this novel, and I am sure my students will enjoy it as well. That came from Jane Thomas Wright, and then Mrs. Bodie Bain to cut it off. What was the mindset in painting Mr. Bailey the way that you did? I see this even working for the family life teachers and the different male or female relationships. That's from Mrs. Halnika Bodie Bain, HOD, CH Junior High School.
Thank you for your question. Um, I in writing on Deb, I don't even think my intention was to write a story that touched on those particular themes of abuse or an abusive man. That's really how the story unfolded, and I just had to sort of let it sort of narrate itself. I didn't have an original intention, but going back to a character like Mr. Bailey, I think he became, and it's um, I guess he's not necessarily around character. He's flat. He does have a few qualities. So he's one-dimensional and can speak to or be a character references for just this spirit of abuse. But I think with his character it presents an opportunity for um, readers, I'll put it readers because it can be students or teachers, to really be able to examine and look at some of the ills that's in this particular society. Abuse is a very big problem. I don't think we talk about it in the ways that we need to talk about it. We kind of keep it quiet in some circles. I think with Mr. Bailey, the intention would be now to create a moral lesson with a particular character like that, or even and discuss some of the cultural issues that we have surrounding that. I think, and sometimes I think persons are a little bit nerved about or cautious about having such heavy hitting social issues and in discussion in literature. But I think literature is the best place to investigate um, the ills of that particular world or the ills of society. So I think even when you sort of bring it up to students, it may present a lot of interesting discussion. Like some persons may possibly be able to connect with it, some may not understand because that's something that's not in their world, embedded in their world, but it's definitely a local issue. And so, and if you notice, I mean, if you read the entire book, this idea of abuse, it comes in very lightly. There's neglect with Teller's character, but with Andeb's story, this is the only story that touches on it, and it feels like a light touch. But I think the way it's presented is very impactful, and it causes pause and some attention for and gives a moment to discuss that issue in a deeper way. Okay. We can probably pause on the questions or
Yes,
comments
ma'am.
for now, so
Yes,
I
ma'am.
can keep to time. So I'm going to start to speed up just a little bit. But the next slide is the stylistic elements. Of course, there's much more elements of style that you can identify and discuss, but I'll just highlight a few. The first is first person narrative. Excuse me. And I am the type of writer I prefer first person because I for me, it allows me to fully immerse myself in a character. I feel more connected to the character. So it's and I also find it interesting because, like I said, Shelby sometimes might seem like a bit of an anti-hero. So hearing it or getting in the mind of someone who sometimes is a little bit harsh with language, I think that there's some complexity with that. There's also a lot of metaphors, similes, personification, hyperbole, symbolism, of course, and more figures of speech. Shelby uses a lot of hyperbole and a lot of similes in describing her world. And I think that's actually, I think that style is what I'm used to, even when I was growing up. That's how we talked. We made a lot of comparison. There was a lot of bantering, for the sake of camaraderie between persons, and so we would describe each other certain ways, or um, describe certain places certain ways. So there's a lot of that. There's also colorful characterizations, as we read. There's use of Bahamian dialect. There's some cultural and even historical references, vivid imagery, particularly for the natural world. And I have here bold descriptors, and I use the word bold. I guess I'm being a little bit euphemistic about it, but I do think just there's some language that can seem a bit crass in terms of how she describes things, but I don't think it fares um, much away from the how language was back in the day. And one thing I will say is that um, it's interesting, and I think I may touch on this in a later slide. This book politically is politically incorrect in some cases due to the language, because there are certain things that Shelby says that she would not get away with if she lived in the United States. So the book itself is a safe space to look at that language and talk about the effect and impacts of that language. But yeah, some of that language can be definitely classified as bold. So I'll move on to the next slide. I think I will just read the one on hyperbole. There's another one on Bahamian dialect, but that comes from Teller, which you guys, most of you have read and are familiar with. So I'll read the one that touches on hyperbole. And this is from the chapter called Yellow Mirror, and some context on Deb gives her a yellow mirror for her birthday. And so this is an excerpt. It reads, "One day, Johnny got hold of the mirror, sliding it off my bureau. 'Where'd you get this?' he asked while I began fidgeting with my bed sheets. 'Aunt Deb gave it for my birthday,' I told him simply. Um, Opening the thing, Johnny briefly glanced at his reflection. 'How come I never seen you playing with it?' I snatched it out of his hands. 'That's 'cause it's not a toy, Johnny. Maybe we should put it in the fort and use it as a magic mirror to look into another world or something. What do you think?' 'I think you're just being silly. Besides, who'd want to play with such a girly thing?' Johnny gently took the mirror from me and placed it on the bureau. Then he turned and smiled at me all big, so big that even a handheld mirror couldn't fit all of it. So Shelby uses a lot of hyperboles, particularly with Johnny, just to stress certain features with his appearance and so forth. But she talks. I mean, she uses hyperbole to talk about his smile, how it's so big a mirror can't fit it. So you'll see traces of hyperbolic language throughout the story. And then I will move on to the other slide that talks about the cultural impact. So that's the next slide over. I'll skip this one on. Yes, okay. So I think this idea of cultural impact, it's just from my personal perspective, it sort of came after Shelby was created because, again, in writing the book, my only goal was to write a great story or what I consider to be a great story. But I realize, especially with the book now, um, matriculating into the schools and being exposed to young readers, there's going to be some cultural impact, or at least I hope there is. And I just wanted to touch on a few points that I would have wanted to see in terms of the impact this book can make. And so I'll just start with the first point. I think it presents cultural study and promotes Bahamian narratives. Um, Shelby, I remember one of my students here at UB, they just read a portion of the book. And I asked her the question if she's able to identify with the character of Shelby. And she said that she not so much yet, but she didn't really read the book. Because I do think that there's something very, I don't want to say dated, but there's something dated about the story that sort of gives students a look into, again, maybe from a child's perspective, the world or the Bahamas before technology, when we actually used to go out and play. So I think it will be a good tool for cultural study. It hopefully definitely promotes more Bahamian / Caribbean narratives. Um, it also, for me, it's my hope is that it broadens the national engagement with literature. I think literature shouldn't just be um, limited to the classroom. Really, literature is life, and we see literature in different forms, not just the written text. We see visual texts, films, or that's also a form of literature. But I think that I would hope for the book to sort of stimulate more engagement with this particular art form. I also would hope that this book de-emphasizes life's dependence on technology. I think technology is very, very useful, but I do think that there can be a balance. I do think that there can be more moments, or, where we probably turn the phone off or, um, turn off social media and engage in other elements of our world, because, we have a beautiful yet challenging world. And so hopefully there's a look at that. I also hope the book inspires an appreciation for the natural world. And I think most of you were here when I presented on a poem called Paradise. It was a very short poem by Aram Sarayan, and it just was very brief, but touches on, I guess, celebrating a snippet of nature. And so I really hope that nature comes to the fore, because our natural world is so beautiful, and so should be appreciative and also conserve and steward. And I think that's something that students can begin to think about. Um, Shelby, I believe, has the ability to start conversations for cultural issues. I don't think it only needs to focus on cultural issues. I think you can also look at cultural strengths because I think there are things that we are doing right, of course. But again, you can use the book and particularly the chapter with Andeb and Teller. I believe they probably are good pieces to talk about certain issues within our society. And this last point, this idea of depoliticizing language, this may actually be a positive or a negative. I want persons to use respectful language, and I think maybe a conversation can be had for that. But and this is my personal belief that language is getting too political, not so much in the Bahamas, but we are going to gain those influences from America and from the broader world, to where um, we have to be so careful with the language that we use is because it can get inflammatory. But I think some of that information is a bit petty and too basic. And so I think, more than political language, we need to sort of introduce the idea of respectful language, um, and considerate language. And I'm going to move on and talk about just a few recommendations for the classroom and then hear back some responses from the chapters read. So you can move to the next slide. Yes. Well, one of the first recommendations I have, and I think this is me probably speaking to my style because right now I typically write in vignettes, not that I mean, at least with novels. What I would love for teachers, when they're going through the book with their students, to hopefully read in chronological order at least once. You can pull chapters and look at it in isolated ways, but there is intertextuality with the book. It still reads as a novel where one chapter may make references to other previous chapters. And so there's more of a deeper meaning being conveyed, due to sort of reading the book as you would a novel. I think that, and forgive the typo, I think that the book also will be a great springboard for writers' techniques. And as stated before, these particular skills that you would need to develop and acquire doesn't just, it's not just regulated to just English. You can also, or just the literature, there can be sort of marrying of the two or a complementing of the two. So I think there's a lot of writers' techniques, that can definitely be investigated. Another point for recommendation, cultural reflection, critique, and I think I touched on that. I mean, there's many opportunities for persons to talk about certain cultural issues, or even to critique culture. There's a story on Johnny's dad where Shelby, she actually she talks about Johnny's dad in a sort of romantic way, but she's only doing it to compare the dad and Johnny. But that's probably a great place to have a discussion about the sort of boundaries, that should be between young women and older men. Um, I think that's a very sometimes a pressing issue here. But some of these issues, they're very light. So unless you're really doing a deep reading, you won't be able to pick it up. But I do think there's room to have some hard conversations or some, I guess, moral conversations with students, and that relates to the next point and sparks discussions about morality and accountability. I would also want there to be a lot of personal responses and connections. I do think that most students will be able to connect with the book, especially seeing a young person sort of narrate and tell their story or live their journey. And I also want to recommend, for particularly those who are interested in creative writing, to use the book as a stimulant for creative writing or creative purposes, whether it's the writing or creative art. So definitely try to engage that. And that is it. So that's the end of the presentation, but I do want to open it up for some general responses to the chapters that was read. I guess if a person's read the book, that's fine, but we can sort of focus on the 3 stories. If persons want to bring up themes, character, style, their own personal reflections or recommendations moving forward. So I want to sort of open it up for you all.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Like I said, that everything was just filled with information. We appreciate it. We have a great appreciation for the text that we as educators, as language educators, literature, will be presenting to our students. Before we would have continued with the presentation, Miss Stephanie Johnson would have said, yes, there is room for interpretation and discussion on issues that many of us like to sweep under the carpet, but they are relevant and valid issues for exposure. Thank you for being true and authentic. And she said, I think you would have apologized. She said, there's no need to apologize for that. This is the power of writing. It allows for needed power of writing. This is the power of writing. It allows for needed discussion, ownership, and accountability. Whether we like it or not, our students are already exposed to these topics.
Thank you
And
for
then
saying
she
that.
further stated that some students will now see writing as a useful outlet for their own unspoken experiences.
I agree. I agree.
Bettina, Shelby looking at the clouds in the sky. Hold on. I think I would have done that one. No, okay. Shelby looking at the sky, looking at the clouds in the sky as it relates to symbolism and spirituality can also mean that God is everywhere and all around us and not always up high or out of reach to us. As clouds take on different forms, colors, and sizes, it kind of juxtaposes itself in that while we cannot see or touch God like human beings can, he is still very much real. It is as if Shelby looking up to the sky is her gentle reminder that God is real. He is watching and taking care of us, and that he will be there in any season for us, for instance, through stormy or sunny days. Wonderful use of nature and natural resources from our land, like bush medicine. And our EO, Miss Wendy Bowe, said, depoliticizing language. I like that. Respectful language. Ernie Samaru, text has the same flavors as Miguel's. He came in late. And LaDawn Barr Thompson, Miss LaDawn says, the book is so nostalgic to those born, especially during the 80s. Sometimes it seems to me like the book is capturing a dying childhood experience. Children no longer want to go outside like Shelby. Instead, they want to stay, I'm scrolling down, instead they want to stay inside and play video games. Thank you for capturing the essence of what once was. Do we have any other comments, questions at this time for Ms. Fraser? Colleagues, are you there? Do you have any other comments or questions for Ms. Fraser on the text before she continues?
Well, sorry.
Okay, you can continue, Ms. Fraser.
No, that's really it. I wanted to hear some general responses from the chapters read. But if there aren't any, that's fine. We can begin to sort of wind down if there are no questions. I do appreciate all the comments and questions posed. This, like I said, this particular book, I mean, it was a lot of work. It was definitely a labor of love, but it really spoke to the child in me. I was excited. I want to say every although it was tough work, I was excited about this child, and I think LaDawn Barr spoke about it. Going back to childhood to share those experiences, of course, fictional, but there are very real elements that speak to what I went through or what I experienced as a child. And so, I would hope that there's some revival of looking at childhood and what that could mean for in today's world.
All right, at this time, we would like to say and extend a heartfelt thank you to Ms. Fraser, the author of our new text. Yes, I'm excited about this text, The Island of Shelbie Mott. Oh, something just came in from Ms. Chantel Evans. With only 3 stories shared so far, I do not have a good grasp of how the story culminates. Can you share for me, please, if Shelbie matures? Is this simply about what LaDawn shared? Does she come to some realization of life? Is maturity a theme, or is this book simply relishing even with adversities of childhood? That's from Ms. Chantel Evans.
Very good question, Ms. Evans. There is a coming of age element to Shelbie Mott. Shelbie does mature in the way that she, I guess, looks at character, because, the book in the beginning, it really speaks to character in a cursory way, in the sense that, even characters like the Three Stooges, she presents so one-dimensionally. But over time, as you read the narrative, there's an engagement with understanding characters in a different way. And so, that speaks to sort of a maturer outlook. One sort of, I guess I'll touch on this tomorrow, but one way she really matures is in the experience of loss, which will come at the end. I won't spoil the book. But this experience of loss and how that forces her to sort of, or even takes away a bit of the childhood innocence and forces her to sort of piece back this very real world. Because, when children, when they experience the world, it's very different from when an adult experiences the world. And so as we have lived, there have been many times where even our outlook of the world or experience of the world has become very broken. And it breaks down. And so there's a rebuilding that happens. Sometimes I want to say, more than once, of course. So depending on the experience. But she does experience certain things that sort of shatters, if you want to say shatters the world to an extent, that causes her to sort of reamalgamate and put the pieces of her world back together. And so she does, at the end of the story, there is a sense of maturity, there's a sense of change. I do want to say that we need a more empathetic and sympathetic character. But I will also say that this book is volume 1. I envision Shelbie Mott as 3 volumes, and so I am will be very intentional about developing more of a character arc between this first installment and the last installment. So, so to answer your question, there is some change, but there's also room for more growth.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, and this one comes from Mr. Samaru from R.M. Billy. He asks, does Shelbie fit the concept of the modern feminist?
I guess it depends on what your concept of the modern feminist is, because I think even that definition has been changing. But I can see Shelbie as a feminist in certain ways. She's very, very independent. There's no reliance on what a man can do for her or her boy. I think she's very, very resourceful. She's very willful. So there are some, I guess, some parallels that one could make between Shelbie and the new feminist or the modern feminist. And again, that definition has changed over time, so I'm sure there's something to track with each definition of the word, but you can definitely probably look at Shelbie in that particular light.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions or comments at this time? Do we have any other comments or questions at this time?
Good afternoon. I posted something, Demetria. I'm sorry.
I'm looking
Mrs.
for
Smith. Mrs. Smith.
That's
Yes.
fine. Okay, Ms. Bridge, I see it.
Oh,
Thank you, Ms. Fraser. Brilliant presentation. I am so pleased with the way in which your work has resonated with educators present here today. That's coming in from Mrs. Pamela Moultrie.
Thank you, Mrs. Moultrie. And I extend my love and appreciation to you, as you know.
All right. Do we have any other questions or comments for Ms. Fraser today?
And I'll be here tomorrow, so if something comes up for tomorrow, that's fine.
You didn't mention humor, but I think it is evident in the stories.
Yes,
mean,
humor
Sandra-
for sure. Humor for sure. I know I didn't mention all the elements. Humor, well, like humor's a big one, I would say, because I can still read Shelbie today, and nothing. I can still read Shelbie today and have a good laugh. I call Shelbie entertaining. I wrote Carnival of Love. I described to my mom. I said Carnival because she's never read Shelbie's yet. I said, well, Carnival's quite emotional, but Shelbie is quite entertaining. So you're gonna laugh. You have a lot of moments of laughter and entertainment.
Ms. Fraser, we thank you so much. And if today is any indication of what tomorrow is to bring, I am looking forward to having an amazing time again tomorrow. On behalf of our EO and all of the other facilitators and my fellow educators, we would like to say thank you so much, and we're looking forward to seeing you and hearing from you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am. Madam EO, are you coming on before I start the giveaways?
All I would like to say is, before we leave, thank you all for being here. In particular, Mistress Moultrie and Mistress Morris, if she's still in the space, as well as our presenter and author, Ms. Fraser. Thank you all for being here and consenting to be a part of this workshop. It was definitely needed, and it's good to see the enthusiasm that teachers have already for this text. I tell you, it's going to be really good, and I think it's going to really help to engage our students in our language arts program. And so, I am looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you for taking time out to be here with us today. And I know that tomorrow will be even better than today. So I shall